Hello, this is Alan Blumkin. I'm on the Comfortably Zoned Radio Network. I'm joined tonight by David Nemec, and we're going to do another podcast of old-time baseball and trivia. Tonight we're going to discuss the history of the Cleveland Indians and baseball in Cleveland in the 19th century. And basically, David is from Cleveland, so he has a very big leg up on the knowledge of how that franchise progressed. Welcome, David.
Welcome to you, Al. Pleasure to be with you again.
Okay, thank you. Well, I know they had a team in the National Association. I think
they did. They went in the National Association, which most baseball historians regard as the first major league. It had some problems. It certainly was not a stable league by any means, but it was all professional. It was fairly well organized, particularly in the beginning, and I credit it as the first major league. And interestingly, the first major league game involved a team from Fort Wayne and Cleveland in 1871. And it began a bizarre, checkered, and extremely interesting history of professional baseball in Cleveland. The very first game, this was in an era where errors were frequent, players were playing without gloves, scores correspondingly were very high. It was not unusual to get a 22-15 or even a 30-18 game. And the very first game in Major League history involving Cleveland and Fort Wayne was won by Fort Wayne at Fort Wayne by a score of 2-0. Shutouts were almost unheard of at that time. And the Cleveland team fielded a pretty good unit, and it was led by James Deacon White. He batted leadoff in the first game, went 3 for 4. But Cleveland was rallying in the top of the ninth inning when White was coming to bat. And White hit a line single and tried to stretch it into a double, was thrown out, and the game ended shortly thereafter with Cleveland down 2-0. But the Cleveland team also had an outfielder pitcher named Charlie Paber. And Paber, as far as I can make out, was probably the first left-handed pitcher in Major League history, and didn't pitch much, played the outfield for the most part. But in 1872, just as Cleveland was about to fold for attendance problems and a lack of funds, Paber pitched an extremely interesting game, the only one of its kind in Major League history. Cleveland had, because of 2 missing players, they had to start the game with only 8 men. They were playing the Brooklyn Eckfords on the road at Brooklyn. And the headline the following day was Eckfords lose to 8 men. Paber pitched a complete game, won the game, and it's the only one in Major League history, if you count the National Association, again, as a major league, that was won by a team that began the day with only 8 players on the field. They only had 2 outfielders. They stretched players around. It was extremely interesting, and the team folded very shortly thereafter. And Cleveland didn't pick up Major League Baseball again until 1879 when they got a team into the National League. And it was basically a pretty solid team. And in 1883, they made a real run for the pennant. And their number one pitcher, Jim McCormick, who was probably in line to become the first 300-game winner if things had gone his way, came down with an elbow injury, and they brought up a left-hander named Will Sawyer they picked him up off the sandlots and gave him the ball and put him in the starting rotation, pitching every third day, And Sawyer had a terrible record, seemingly 4-10, and Cleveland, which had been in contention all throughout the 1883 season, fell apart in the last month and finished pretty well out of the race. But Sawyer, in the meantime, his 4-10 record was extremely deceptive because he had given up the fewest hits per 9 innings of any qualifier in the league that year, the National League. Nobody noticed it at the time because nobody kept track of statistics like that. But in retrospect, you really wonder what would have happened if they'd kept Sawyer another year or two, because he was a very good pitcher. Instead, Cleveland went into the 1884 season without Sawyer and lost their top 3 players, 2 of their top 3 players anyway, and Jack Glasscock, their shortstop, McCormick, their number 1 pitcher, and a catcher named Fatty Briotti. They all jumped to the Union Association. And when they left, Cleveland went in the dumpster and finished well out of the race. The team folded, and they didn't pick up Major League Baseball again until 1887, when they joined the American Association in place of the Pittsburgh team, which had fled to the National League after 1886. And the 1887 team played 2 years in the American Association and then jumped to the National League, and became a pretty formidable entry in the National League in the 1890s. They were by that time called the Spiders because, for a number of reasons, the credited reason for the most part is because the players were relatively skinny, they looked like spiders in uniform. And they began the 1890s as a relatively poor National League team, but picked up a pitcher right away in 1890 named Cy Young, who was, in my estimation, the best pitcher in the 19th century, all told. And he was handicapped in that Cleveland during the 1890s had a very strong team with a glaring weakness every season. They had an outfield which had Jesse Burkett, who had 400 seasons, also batting leads. He led the league in batting, and that they had nobody to go with him. They had a center fielder named Jimmy McClear, who was a good fielder but no hit, and a right fielder named Harry Blake, who also was good field, no hit. And that kept Cleveland from being the number 1 team probably in the 1890s. We remember now today the Baltimore Orioles, where they won 3 straight pennants in the middle 1890s, and the Boston Beaneaters as the also a very strong team. But the Cleveland Spiders were right there with them, and for the lack of a good hitting outfielder, they stayed pretty well. They stayed back in the pack. They won a Temple Cup Series. They were second a number of times, but never broke through to win the pennant. And then at the end of the 1899 season, the National League, which at that time had 12 teams, cut back to 8 teams, and among the missing were Cleveland, which had ended the century on a very dismal note. With syndicate ownership, most of their better players had gone to St. Louis, and they finished a very, very bad last. And the team, as a result, folded after that season.
They spent most of the season on the road, especially.
Yeah, they did.
Yeah.
They drew, and that's interesting, Al, because the team all throughout the 19th century was never a good drawing card at home. They always had trouble. Their attendance was down every single year. So by 1899, they just threw in the towel and said, we're going to play all our games on the road because there's nobody coming to our games here anyway. So let's just send the team out to pasture and see what happens.
Well, from what I understand, they tried to play Sunday ball, which was prohibited at that point, and also they couldn't, sell alcohol in the stands. And when they tried to play a Sunday game there, I think the team was some of the members of the team were arrested.
Yeah.
And
Sunday ball was prohibited in the National League until it combined with the American Association after the 1891 season. And then at that time, teams were given the option of whether they wanted to play on Sunday or not. And the Western teams, like Cleveland, for the most part, tried it. The Eastern teams, like Boston and New York and Brooklyn, which had stricter blue laws, Philadelphia also, had to stay away from playing on Sunday. But Cleveland then ended the 19th century with no longer having a major league team. In 1900, they were in the minor league American League, which had formerly been the Western League. And it had changed its name at the end of the 1899 season at the behest of its president, Van Johnson, to the American League. And at the end of the 1900 season, it declared itself a major league. And Cleveland then entered the American League as one of the original 8 American League teams. And they had a very good owner, Charlie Summers, who had money, he had ambition, but he got shut out on a number of ways. They still had an attendance problem. They never got the players they really wanted to gel into a very strong team. But nevertheless, in 1906, Cleveland fielded a team that has been matched only once in history. They led the American League in batting. They led the American League in fielding. They led the American League in earned run average, which they won the team triple crown. Now, every team in Major League history, with 2 exceptions, has won the pennant if they won the team triple crown. Cleveland 1906 is the last team to do it. The only previous team to do it was the 1885 New York Giants in the National League. So Cleveland had some very strong teams throughout the early part of the century.
They had 1908 team missed by half a game because in those days the teams were not American League did not compel the teams to make up games that were rained out.
Yeah.
Detroit finished a half a game ahead of them, and 1 game ahead of the White Sox. And Detroit and the White Sox both had unplayed games. Had they played those games, it might have been a different story. So Cleveland became the first pennant, the first team in Major League history to lose a pennant by half a game. And the only time that's happened since was even in a division was when the Tigers beat the Red Sox out in 1972 by half a game because a number of games were canceled by the early season. Right?
Yeah. In the American League and National League, that's true. And in Federal League in 1915, there was another incident where St. Louis team, I believe, finished half a game out. But the American League and National League, Cleveland, And that pretty much, that set the tone for Cleveland's history right away. They have a triple crown winning team in 1906. They don't win. 2 years later, they have a team that loses by half a game. They don't win. In 1918, they put together another very strong team, and they're on their way. Their team is really rolling into the latter part of the season, and then the season was truncated by World War I. It was canceled. It was stopped after Labor Day in early September. And Cleveland was just a couple games behind Boston, driving, seemingly ahead toward the pennant. Again, they were denied. So the first team that actually broke through to win a pennant for a Cleveland Major League franchise was the 1920 Indians. Now, the 1920 Indians also had a very bizarre and checkered history because their leadoff hitter, Ray Chapman, was the first and only player ever killed as a result of an accident or injury that he suffered in a major league game. He was hit by a pitch in Yankee Stadium, not Yankee Stadium, I'm sorry. Yankees were still playing in Polo Grounds. In August, was carried off the field unconscious, died in the hospital that night. And the Cleveland team was totally demoralized, but they came through. They put it together, picked up a shortstop out of college named Joel Sewell, went on to win the pennant in the 1920 World Series, and then Cleveland then at that point became quite a strong team throughout the 20s and 30s.
During that ball era, they had some very, very well-known players. They had Napoli Joey. Most of the time, they had Addie Joss, who was one of the best pitchers in the American League, who unfortunately passed away at an early age of 1911 from tuberculosis. Joss pitched the perfect game against the White Sox in the heat of the 1908 pennant race, and won the game 1-0. Ed Walsh of the White Sox, a Hall of Famer, struck out 15 in the game in a losing cause, and that still is the record for most strikeouts by a pitcher who wound up losing a perfect game. And another one they had was Shoeless Joe Jackson, who they gotten from the Philadelphia A's. And do you know why they shipped Jackson to the White Sox for? I think it was Brago.
They traded him for really nobody of Brago Roth, a couple other guys, nobody of consequence. Jackson had didn't have a very good year, and really Jackson wasn't. Jackson was a great hitter, a good ball player, but he wasn't really a guy that fit well with a team that was, hadn't coalesced as yet. He wasn't. He played more or less for himself, pretty much, and Cleveland got rid of him. They didn't get a good trade for him at all. The team went in the dumpster. They finished in last place for the first time in 1914. And then in 1914 and 15, interestingly, Cleveland was the only one of the original 16 teams, franchises, to be rivaled in its city by a minor league team. Because in order to keep the Federal League, the Rebel Federal League out of Cleveland in 14 and 15, the American Association was inveigled to put a team in Cleveland. And so Cleveland had a major league team and a minor league team at the same time. That was not uncommon in the 19th century, but it was certainly one of a kind in the 20th century. And they had a lot of interesting stuff. The Cleveland history is well worth reading, well worth studying. You can examine seasons.
Greg, right? That pitcher named Veen Gregg.
Yeah.
I think won 20 more in his first 3 seasons and came down with arm trouble. And then in 1916, they managed to buy Chris Speaker from the Red Sox, which was, I'm sure, a player deal that shocked the baseball world at the time. And Chris Speaker became the player manager and was there when they won the pennant in 1920. The 1920 team is also famous because quite a few of their players lived into their 90s.
Yeah, they were a good team. A good team going into the 20s, and with Speaker, at the helm, and it was probably the best fielding outfielder of his time, and one of the finest hitters. They remained strong throughout the early 20s, and continued to field good teams off and on all throughout the 30s, but never broke through. 1936 team. Very formidable hitting, suspect pitching, and finished pretty far off the pace because they were playing. The Yankees were in competition, were everybody's competition, and there was nobody who could put together a team to really give the Yankees much trouble on a consistent basis throughout the 20s and 30s. And Cleveland gave it a good shot. Boston at times gave it a good shot. Washington broke through here and there. The Philadelphia broke through here and there. But basically the Yankees dominated the 20s and 30s.
And then we get to 1936 when they signed this 17-year-old rookie pitcher out of Van Meter, Iowa, named Bob Feller, who came on as with a hype that was never, very rarely given to a player in his first year, because he could throw the ball close to 100 miles an hour, which in those days wasn't really done. And Feller became a tremendous drawing card. Along with fulfilling his promise as a pitcher. And I think in 1940 was the year of, they called the Crybabies, because the Indians had a manager named Oscar Vitt, who the players detested. And they went to the owner in, I think, July or August of that season, saying that they could win the pennant if they got rid of Vitt. And the owner, Alfred Bradley, refused, and they wound up losing the pennant by, I think, by 1 game to the Tigers at the end of that season.
Yeah, it was a very, very bizarre ending. Again, Cleveland's full of bizarre endings and bizarre, and they lost. Feller was starting the next to last game of the season. Cleveland was 1 game out. They needed to win to stay in the race. And Feller was facing a guy named Floyd Gibel, a 30-year-old rookie of no consequence who was, more or less thrown to the wolves because Detroit was conceding that game and trying to win the last game of the season, which would decide the pennant race. And Gibel ended up shutting out Cleveland and Feller. Nobody believed it. And if you look back to this day, it's, you blink, because how did this happen? But Cleveland had, they were close but no cigar year after year after year after year, except for 1920. And then finally, they got an owner at the end of World War II named Bill Veeck. And Veeck changed around very dramatically.
Bob Feller went into the Navy right after the attack on Pearl Harbor, so he was missing for 3 complete seasons and a good portion of 1945 before he came out. And then Veeck bought them in 1946 and started shaking things up quite a bit. They had Lou Boudreau, who was a shortstop and became the player manager. And he brought guys from all over the place, including in 1947, becoming the first owner in the American League to break the player color line when they brought in Larry Doby.
And Doby at that time was from the Negro Leagues and was a second baseman. Cleveland already had a good second baseman, Joe Gordon. So they were in a quandary what to do with Doby, and they tried him in the outfield, and he ended up being their center fielder in 1948. And again, Cleveland was in a very bizarre pennant race, where it came down to the last game of the season. All they had to do was win. They were facing Detroit at home, and they'd beaten Detroit the day before with a rookie named Gene Bearden, which had clinched at least a tie for the pennant. And they had Bob Feller going against Hal Newhouser, who was a very formidable pitcher. And Newhouser beat the Tribe, and that forced a playoff game, which was going to be played at Boston in Fenway Park. And Boudreau had exhausted Feller. Bob Lemon was not rested, and went to the club and said, "Well, who are we going to pitch in this game? It's Fenway Park. We can't, this is, with the Green Monster facing us." And the team ended up deciding to pitch Gene Bearden on 2 days of rest, and actually only 1 day of rest going into Monday. And Bearden pitched a fantastic game. Cleveland won the game at Fenway Park and went to the World Series against the Boston Braves in 1948. And Feller was rested enough to start the first game at Boston, and lost 1-0 on one of the most controversial plays in World Series history, when he seemingly picked off Phil Macy at second base, and Boudreaux held up the ball, and the umpire called Macy safe. And Macy ended up scoring the only run of the game, beating Feller 1-0, and that was the closest Bob ever came to winning a World Series game. And it was a great disappointment in his life, because I talked to him once, and he said that was really the most disheartening game he ever pitched.
The Red Sox started a pitcher named Denny Galehouse in that playoff game, who I think was 8-7 going into that game, and really was no match for anything. And the Indians just tattooed him in that playoff game. And Boudreaux went, I think, 4 for 4 with a couple of doubles, and they just beat Denny and McCarthy. Joe McCarthy was managing the Red Sox at the time. Came under very, very heavy criticism for using Galehouse to start that game.
Yeah, I think Boston entered the game a little bit overconfident. They felt like, okay, Cleveland's pitching Bearden, he's a left-hander. We've got the Green Monster. We've got a very formidable team of right-handed hitters led by Vern Stevens. We've got Ted Williams. We've got Pesky. We've got a excellent hitting team. We're gonna tattoo this guy, and it didn't work out that way. And Bearden that year was just extraordinary, because down the stretch he, in September, if you look at his September record, it's unmatched in Major League history. And, he just won, he's just unstoppable. And then he won the second game, he won the first game of the World Series ever played in Cleveland Municipal Stadium, which was game 3 of the series, and then saved game 6 at Braves Field, and that decided the World Series. Cleveland ended the 1948 season as world champions very unexpectedly, and had a seemingly bright future staring them in the face. But they were facing again another dynasty put together by the Yankees and led by Casey Stengel. Stengel won in 49 with the Yankees. He won in 50 with the Yankees. He won in 51 with the Yankees. He won in 52 with the Yankees. He won in 53 with the Yankees. And in 54, Stengel had his best team in terms of won-loss record that he ever had. And he finished second place, not even mildly in contention. When Cleveland put together the best won-loss record in American League history, and won the pennant going away by about 8 or 10 games, and went into the World Series a very heavy favorite against the New York Giants.
With the 22 games with the Yankees and the 22 games with the White Sox, what the Indians did in 1954, the Red Sox that year had finished 4th in the American League, winning 69 games, and the Indians just beat the living heck out of those 5 bottom teams.
Yeah.
And has some really, really bad teams like the first-year Orioles and the last-year Philadelphia A's, and the Indians just clobbered those teams and infinitum. And then they came to the Polo Grounds for the World Series. And the first game of that World Series, this is where Mays made the catch off Vic Wertz. The ball Wertz hit would have probably been a home run in any other ballpark. And at the bottom of the 10th, Dusty Rose with 2 men on pinch hit a home run that dropped into the first or second row down the right field line of the Polo Grounds, which is 258 feet away from home plate. And that game had been played any place other than the Polo Grounds might have resulted in a different outcome.
It almost undoubtedly would have, yeah. And then, and then Cleveland started, down 0-1, and they lost the second game in the Polo Grounds. They came back to Cleveland Stadium. They were a demoralized team, and they ended up being swept, which is probably the greatest sweep upset in Major League World Series history, because Cleveland was seemingly on paper a much stronger team. But they had a very bright future ahead of them after that season, because they had coming up from the Indianapolis Farm Club, probably considered to be the most promising left-hander if not in Major League history, certainly in post-World War II history, in Herb Score from Lake Worth, Florida. And Score had a tremendous rookie season in 1955 and almost pulled them into contention. They were still with the Yankees pretty much down to the wire. And in 56, they were looked upon as the favorite in the American League. And then Cleveland had another, abysmal tragedy when early in the season in the game at Cleveland Stadium, Gil McDougall of the Yankees had a line drive through the box and hit Score.
Yeah.
And that in the cheekbone, fractured his cheekbone, he almost lost the sight of an eye, and he was never again the same pitcher. And
well, ironically, in 1956, they had 3 20-game winners. Bob Lemon, Herb Score, and Early Wynn, who they picked up from the Washington after 1948, and he became a tremendous pitcher. He always said that he didn't know anything about pitching until Mel Harder became his pitching coach in Cleveland and turned him into a terrific pitcher. And Gil McDougall, ironically, after he hit the line drive that ruined Score in 1957, McDougall always said that that took the heart out of the game from him, and he had a very good year in 56, was on his way to another very good year in 57, and that just took the starch out of him, and he descended into mediocrity and retired after 1960 rather than be subject to the American League expansion drift.
Yeah. But Cleveland, they still, with Score, they had every promise in the world of winning a couple more pennants in the late 50s. It didn't happen, but Score was still a member of the team in 59 when Joe Gordon, the Cleveland second baseman in 48 when they won the World Series, was managing the club. And Cleveland led for most of the season. And Chicago came to Cleveland in September for a 4-game series that was pretty much going to decide the pennant. And Cleveland had, high hopes, definitely, prospects of even maybe sweeping the 4 games. And instead they got swept at home by the White Sox. And that took all the heart out of them. And the Tribe finished second. And for Cleveland fans, it was a long, long time before they played a meaningful game again in September.
Well, the general manager at that time was Frank Lane. And Frank Lane was, by that time, at such an ego that he couldn't stand any player that got more publicity than him. And he wound up wrecking the team. Right after the season, he traded Cal McLish, who had been the ace of the staff for 58 and 59. It was a 19-game winner in 1959. And shipped him to the Reds for second baseman Johnny Temple, who was on the way down. And then, of course, the day before the 1960 season opened, he made, probably one of the most unpopular trades in the Cleveland history by sending the home run champ and fan favorite Rocky Colavito to the Tigers, even up for the Tigers' 1959 batting champion, Harvey Keene. And
sometimes,
that trade was basically the beginning of the end.
There's another trade in there that's sometimes forgotten that may have been almost as consequential as the Colavito deal. Cleveland had acquired Norm Cash, who was a backup first baseman from the Chicago White Sox. And they decided to trade Cash to the Detroit Tigers prior to the beginning of the 1960 season for a minor league third baseman named Steve Demeter. And Cash ended up being a tremendous hitter in the early 60s in particular, won the batting title in 61 and was very strong throughout the decade, which was not a hitter's decade by the end of it. And who knows with Cash at first base what Cleveland might have done, but they never had a chance even to display him for one game because Lane made that deal too. And as Al says, he really pretty much wrecked that team.
And also Terry Pluto came out about a dozen years ago with a book called The Curse of Rocky Colavito, in which he details the Indians' foibles and follies after the trade until they started putting together a team in the 1990s. And they had, for most of the 1960s, they would be in first place by June, and then have a June swoon where they proceeded to lose a tremendous number of games and fall completely out of the race. They had a ton of, like any dysfunctional organization, they had several owners, most of whom were cash poor. They had a ton of managers, a ton of general managers, and it was somewhat like a zoo there because they would bring in these players. They couldn't perform, so they trade them for other players who couldn't perform. And in the 1970s, they concluded 2 trades with the Yankees, which shipped Chris Chambliss and Greg Nettles to the Yankees, and they play on 3 straight pennant winners and 2 world champions with the Yankees. They just make these kinds of trades all the time.
And Cleveland, in return, got people like Doc Ellis, or not Doc Ellis, Johnny Ellis,
yeah,
and Charlie Spikes,
yeah,
an outfielder who had some promise in the beginning but never developed. And Rusty Torres, guys who seemingly had promise, but other teams recognized were not going to develop. Cleveland didn't. And so from 1959 to 1994, really, the Cleveland Indians were never a factor in the American League race late in the season.
They had like 3 or 4 seasons when they were over 500, and some of them were just barely. In fact, in 1987, they had lost 100 games. In 1985, they won, I think it was 84 in 1986, and Sports Illustrated had them winning the World Series.
Yeah, right. They featured them on the
team lost over 100 games that year.
It was the kiss of death because they got off to a terrible start, and they were in the cellar, and they stayed there for the entire season, and it was really a travesty.
Do you think?
Yeah,
I know one of the things that Bill Veeck did when he owned the team was he put all the games in Municipal Stadium because they were playing the weekend games in Municipal Stadium and the weekday games at League Park. And Lou Boudreaux's autobiography, he said that was like playing 3/4 of the season on the road.
Yeah, it was. Yeah, there were the stadiums couldn't have been more different. The Cleveland Municipal Stadium had, a tremendously, deep outfield until fences were put in 1947. It seated in the 80,000s. You could get, and they did draw crowds like that in 1948 in particular. Whereas League Park was a very compact, old-time ballpark, with short porches, particularly in right field. And it was almost like playing in a minor league park for a major league team going into the 1940s. But then they did go to Cleveland Stadium for all their games after 1946. And Veeck was one of a kind as an owner. He did all kinds of crazy things. He not only signed Doby, but he signed Satchel Paige, who everybody thought this is just a hype to boost attendance. What can Paige have left? The guy's about 45, 46 years old, and Paige ended up being one of their top pitchers, came in out of the bullpen, came in as a starter, and really helped that team win the 48 pennant. And then, Veeck had stuff like Joe Early night. A fan wrote into him, and said, you have all these nights for players who are making all kinds of money. He's giving them cars and, TV sets and so forth. Why don't you have a night for somebody who's not like that? Why don't you have a night for the average fan? So Veeck listened, and he said, okay, we're going to have a night for you, Joe. We're going to have a Joe Early night. And they gave this guy, all kinds of stuff. He came out, he was just a fan. And Veeck Veeck would do almost anything to hype attendance, to make the team. He also did it to make the team better. And he managed to combine both boosting attendance and boosting the club at the same time in ways that few owners have ever done before or since.
Yeah, well, in 1994, they started to build a team that really came around, and 1995, in the strike-shortened season of 144 games, they won 100 games. They had Jim Tomei, and Manny Ramirez, Roberto Alomar, Kenny Lofton, Omar Vizquel.
Sandy was catching, and
And Roberto was playing second base at that point for them.
No, not with Cleveland. He was still in the National League.
No,
he came over to Baltimore, I think around 95 or so.
Stop. He was there in 1999.
He was toward their end of their dynasty in the 90s. Yeah, Roberto and Sandy were a brother team with Cleveland. But then the 94-95 team, the 95 team in particular was very, very strong, as Al said. They were
winning the pennant and losing in the World Series to the Atlanta Braves, which is the only time the Braves won the World Series during that whole 14-year run of division titles. And they bounced back in 1997 to win the second pennant in 3 years, and they were playing the upstart Marlins in the World Series. And the last game, I'll never forget this, they had a relief, the one-run lead. They had a relief pitcher named Mike Jackson in there in the 7th and 8th. He retired 5 in a row with no problem. Of course, they pulled him because he wasn't the so-called closer, and they brought in Jose Mesa.
To start at the bottom of the ninth. And Mesa gave up immediately. Moises flew, and
right here.
Yeah.
And Mesa coughed up the tying run in the 9th inning. The game went into the 11th inning, and the Marlins won it in the bottom of the 11th. And they had a very strong team for the next few years. In 1999, they became one of the few teams in Major League history to score over 1,000 runs in a season.
Yeah, they had a lot of young power hitters, most of whom got traded for middle relief pitchers, and it brought down the dynasty as a result.
And they went through a number of sour years until this past season, when all of a sudden everything clicked. They had some wonderful young players, such as Francisco Lindor, and some of the others, and they got some very, very decent pitching, and they won the pennant. They beat the Red Sox. They swept the Red Sox in the League Championship Series, and they beat Toronto in the they swept the Red Sox in the League Division Series, and they swept
Division Series,
Toronto in the League Championship, and they had a 3-1 lead in games against the Cubs before
their pitching just ran out of steam.
Ran out of gas. But they've signed Edwin Encarnacion to DH for the next 3 years, and the team should be a force for quite a while.
If their pitching holds up, if their young arms continue to be strong, and they have a manager, I consider him to be the best manager in baseball, Terry Francona. And interestingly, the last team prior to 94 to almost win the pennant was a 59 team, and Terry's father Tito had come to the Indians just prior to the season, expected to be a substitute and occasional fill-in at first base in the outfield, and Tito ended up almost winning the American League batting championship, and had the best average, but he didn't have enough plate appearances to qualify. And so the lineage is there. Now, Terry has been nicknamed Tito after his father. He's going to probably carry that nickname for the rest of his time with the Indians, and Indians fans, and I'm certainly one of them, hope he's there for a long, long time, because he's really a fine manager, and they finally have a team that looks like it could stay around for a while.
Well, hopefully it's a new era in Cleveland, and they have a team that hopefully in the next year or two will bring a World Series title to them. David, I want to thank you very much for this program on the Cleveland Indians. I hope everybody enjoys it that listens to it.
Well, thank you, Al. I really enjoyed talking with you about it, and it's been a really enjoyable experience.
Okay, thank you, David, and hopefully we'll be back, same bat time, same bat channel next week. Excuse me about the time. We'll probably be back to 4 o'clock next week. And hopefully everybody who listens to this will gain some knowledge from it and enjoy the back and forth. Thank you again, David.
Thank you, Al.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Al, still there?